"Pay my credit card," she said, her eyes sharp, her voice demanding as though I owed her more than just money. In that single moment, I felt something inside me snap, not out of anger, but out of a sudden clarity. Instead of reaching for my wallet, I reached for something else entirely, a divorce lawyer's card I had tucked away, almost as if my subconscious had been saving it for this very day. That was the moment everything changed, and the story I'm about to share is one of how years of love, compromise, and sacrifice finally collided with the realization that sometimes the price of staying is far more costly than the price of leaving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When I look back on it now, I can see the irony in her request. It wasn't about the credit card. It was about control, entitlement, and a one-sided arrangement that had been building for years. Her words were simply the trigger, the spark that ignited a decision I had been avoiding for far too long. But to understand why this request carried so much weight, you need to know who I was before that moment, what my life looked like, and how I found myself standing there with the strength to choose a lawyer's number instead of another bill. My name is Marcus Hayes, and for most of my adult life I've prided myself on being dependable. I wasn't the type to miss deadlines, forget anniversaries, or leave responsibilities unfinished. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, I watched my father work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, while my mother somehow managed to make even the smallest celebrations feel like grand occasions. From them, I learned discipline, patience, and the belief that relationships were built on sacrifice. So when I met Alyssa, bright, charming, and fiercely ambitious, I thought I had found the perfect partner to share my values and my future. In the beginning, everything about her seemed magnetic. She had a way of speaking that made ordinary conversations feel like grand adventures, and she carried herself with a confidence I had always admired from afar. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming party, where she spent nearly an hour telling me about her dreams of working in fashion marketing and traveling the world. I was captivated not just by her beauty but by the fire in her words. To a man like me, who had spent his 20s carefully building a steady career in IT consulting, she represented a spark of spontaneity and ambition that I secretly craved. We started dating, and within months, I found myself rearranging my life around hers. Dinner plans, weekend trips, even career opportunities. I filtered all of it through the lens of how it might fit into our growing relationship. She often spoke of wanting stability, someone who could match her drive but also provide a sense of grounding. I believed I could be that anchor, the steady presence beside her whirlwind energy. When she hinted that her lease was ending and moving in together would make financial sense, I didn't hesitate. It felt like the natural progression of what I thought was a deepening love story. Those first months of living together were filled with laughter and small joys. We decorated our shared apartment with mismatched furniture, argued playfully over where the coffee mugs should go, and spent late nights watching movies with takeout cartons stacked on the table. Looking back, I realized those were the good times, the chapter where everything felt promising, where the sacrifices I made seemed worthwhile because they were in service of building something lasting. But even in those early days, there were small cracks, things I brushed aside as quirks or differences in personality. She had expensive tastes, for one. While I was content with budget-friendly dinners and saving for the future, Alyssa gravitated toward designer handbags, high-end restaurants, and spontaneous shopping sprees. At first, I chalked it up to her working in an industry where appearances mattered. When she asked me to cover the bill here and there, I didn't think much of it. I told myself that love wasn't about keeping score, that generosity was part of being a good partner. But each time, I felt a slight unease, a whisper in the back of my mind that maybe I was giving more than I should. Still, I silenced that whisper. After all, wasn't this what relationships were about? Compromise, generosity, trust. Besides, she made me feel alive in ways I hadn't experienced before. She was adventurous, always pulling me out of my comfort zone, whether it was trying a new cuisine or booking a last-minute trip to Los Angeles. I told myself these were the experiences I had been missing, that the cost, financial and emotional, was just part of the package. But standing there years later, with her voice demanding that I pay her credit card bill, all of those whispers, all of those red flags I had ignored, came crashing back into focus. This wasn't just about money. It was about the imbalance that had defined our relationship from the start. the slow erosion of my boundaries in exchange for a version of love that never quite felt reciprocated. And in that moment, for the first time, I didn't silence the voice inside me, I listened. I didn't argue with her, I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I looked her in the eye and nodded, as though I was agreeing. But inside, I was already making the call that would set me free. That was the beginning of the end, though at the time, she didn't know it. She thought I would once again bend, once again sacrifice without question. What she didn't realize was that her demand had finally pushed me to the point of no return. And so, this story begins with that moment of clarity, the instant when years of compromise gave way to the determination to reclaim my life. This isn't just about paying a credit card bill. It's about understanding what we truly owe ourselves when love becomes a burden instead of a gift. Before that pivotal moment when everything unraveled, my life appeared, on the surface at least, to be stable and grounded. I was 35 years old, well into my career as an IT consultant, and proud of the professional reputation I had carefully built over the years. My work demanded long hours, problem-solving skills, and an ability to adapt to constantly changing environments, but it also gave me a sense of pride and security. While others chased promotions for titles or prestige, I valued consistency, knowing that stability could be the foundation for building a family, a home, and a future. I rented a modest two-bedroom apartment in Portland's Northwest District, a place that struck a balance between practical and comfortable. It wasn't lavish, but it was mine, and it reflected my personality: organized, unpretentious, functional. Before Alyssa entered my life, my evenings were often spent either at the gym, cooking simple meals, or reading books about personal finance and history. I had built a quiet rhythm, one that many would call ordinary but to me felt reliable. People who knew me often described me as someone who could be counted on, the type of person who didn't make grand gestures but who always showed up when it mattered. My friends would tease me about how predictable I was, ordering the same black coffee from the cafe around the corner, setting aside a fixed amount each month in my savings account, and rarely straying from my weekly schedule. Yet beneath that predictability was a man who carried the lessons of his upbringing deeply. My father Raymond had worked himself to exhaustion in construction, while my mother Clara worked part-time as a receptionist. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was resilient, built on a foundation of shared responsibility and mutual respect. I admired that and carried it into my own vision of what a relationship should look like. When I met Alyssa, she disrupted that routine in ways that both thrilled and unsettled me. She was bold where I was cautious, expressive where I was reserved, and extravagant where I was frugal. I still remember how she would come over to my place in those early months, scan the neatly organized shelves of books and files, and laugh at how everything was labeled or arranged with precision. "Marcus, you live like an accountant from the 1950s, she'd say, teasing me, and I would laugh along even though deep down I took pride in the order I maintained. To her, I think, my predictability seemed like a blank canvas, something she could color, reshape, maybe even mold into her version of what life should be. But even as I recognized the differences between us, I allowed myself to be swept into her orbit. She had a charisma that made her seem larger than life. She talked about her job in fashion marketing as though it were a stepping stone to something grander. She spoke of one day moving to New York, building her own agency, and traveling to Europe for seasonal shows. Her energy was intoxicating, and I convinced myself that by supporting her dreams, I was building a future we could both share. I was the grounding force, the safety net, while she was the spark that lit up every room we entered together. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. My friends had mixed opinions about her. Some thought she was charming and fun, the kind of person who could push me out of my comfort zone. Others were less convinced, pointing out how often she seemed to dismiss my opinions, or how she always managed to redirect conversations back to herself. I brushed off their concerns, thinking they simply didn't understand her ambition the way I did. In truth, I didn't want to admit to myself that there were already warning signs. Signs that suggested our values were not aligned in the way I had convinced myself they were. Financially, we approached life from entirely different perspectives. I had always lived within my means, avoiding debt whenever possible, while Alyssa seemed comfortable carrying balances on her credit cards, reassuring herself that she would pay them off when the next big commission came through at work. She had a revolving door of handbags, clothes, and cosmetics, items that I could never quite justify in my own life. Early on, when she would suggest expensive restaurants, I would tell myself that occasional indulgence was fine, that I could afford it, and that relationships required compromise. What I didn't realize then was that this pattern, me giving in to her expectations while suppressing my discomfort, was becoming the foundation of our dynamic. At home, our differences became more apparent as the months rolled by. My evenings had once been quiet, often filled with reading or catching up on projects. But now they were punctuated by Alyssa's energy, her need for constant stimulation, whether that meant streaming shows late into the night, scrolling through online shops, or planning yet another outing. My tidy apartment gradually transformed into something else. Boxes from online deliveries piled in corners, receipts scattered on countertops, clothes draped over furniture. I would clean up silently, trying to maintain the sense of order I needed, but it often felt like I was trying to hold back a tide that kept crashing in. Still, I clung to the belief that these were simply differences to be managed. After all, wasn't every relationship built on compromise? I thought of my parents, how they had navigated disagreements with patience and persistence, and I told myself that I could do the same. But the truth was that my compromises were not being matched by hers. For every time I bent, she pushed further, testing how much I would give without pushing back. On the outside, we looked like a thriving couple. We attended social events, smiled for pictures, and gave the impression of a young pair building their life together. Inside, though, I was beginning to feel a dissonance, a quiet nagging that the person I was becoming in this relationship was not the same man I had worked so hard to be. My dependable nature, once a strength, was becoming a tool she could manipulate, turning my generosity into obligation. And yet, despite the growing imbalance, I stayed. I told myself love was worth it, that Alyssa simply needed time to mature, to balance her ambitions with responsibility. I convinced myself that patience would pay off, that the sacrifices I was making were investments in a brighter future we would share. What I didn't see, at least not yet, was how much of myself I was giving away, piece by piece, in exchange for a love that demanded more than it returned. If I trace everything back to its true beginning, it wasn't the moment Alyssa asked to move in with me, or even when we first said, "I love you." The roots of it all can be found in the very first sparks of our relationship, in those early encounters when everything seemed effortless, intoxicating, and full of promise. At the time, I believed I was stepping into the kind of love story I had always dreamed of, one where two people complemented each other's strengths and helped balance each other's weaknesses. What I didn't realize was that those early days, though beautiful on the surface, were already whispering truths I chose to ignore. The very first time we crossed paths was at that housewarming party, but it wasn't until our second meeting that something truly began. A week later, one of our mutual friends invited us both to a group brunch at a trendy cafe downtown. I remember walking in, spotting her at the far end of the table, sunlight catching her hair just right and feeling an immediate pull. She wore confidence like a garment, speaking animatedly to the people around her while her hands painted pictures in the air. When our eyes met across the table, she smiled in a way that felt like a challenge, as if she already knew she would leave an impression on me. That morning, we ended up sitting side by side, and what struck me was how quickly she could switch gears in conversation. One moment she was joking about something lighthearted, and the next she was dissecting the latest marketing trends with precision and flair. I was used to more grounded discussions, the kind you'd expect from a group of friends catching up over coffee, but with her, everything seemed elevated. I found myself leaning in, hanging onto her words, not because I fully understood everything she was saying, but because her energy was so captivating. By the end of brunch, we were exchanging numbers, and I walked out of that cafe with the kind of excitement I hadn't felt in years. Our first official date was at an art gallery. Alyssa suggested it, insisting that the atmosphere would be more inspiring than another dinner and drinks routine. I agreed, though art galleries were never really my scene. I was nervous, trying to imagine how I would contribute to conversations about paintings and sculptures, but she swept me along with ease. As we wandered from one exhibit to another, she spoke passionately about colors, textures, and symbolism, often weaving in stories from her own life. When she asked what I thought about a particular piece, a chaotic blend of sharp lines and dark shades, I admitted I didn't quite get it, and she laughed, telling me that was the beauty of art, There didn't need to be one right answer. That moment, her laughter echoing in the gallery, was when I realized how different she was from anyone I had ever dated. We ended that night with drinks at a rooftop bar, overlooking the city lights. She leaned across the table and told me she wanted a life that felt bigger than what most people settled for. "I don't want ordinary," she said, her eyes glinting with determination. "I want extraordinary." I nodded, partly because I admired her ambition, and partly because I wanted to be part of whatever extraordinary life she envisioned. That declaration of hers lingered in my mind for days afterward, planting the seed that maybe I too could step outside the confines of my predictability and experience something greater. In those first few months, everything seemed like a whirlwind. She introduced me to new restaurants, new people, new experiences. I found myself saying yes to things I would normally decline: late-night karaoke sessions, spontaneous road trips, and elaborate dinner parties where she seemed to know everyone worth knowing. I was both exhilarated and exhausted, swept up in her current, but unwilling to admit I was barely keeping pace. When she would thank me for being so steady, so reliable, I took it as a compliment, believing that my calmness balanced her vivacity. I didn't yet understand that those words also hinted at the roles we were already beginning to play in each other's lives. Looking back, there were signs even then, like the time she forgot her wallet during one of our early dinners, brushing it off with a charming smile and a quick, "You've got this one, right?" Or the way she would talk about her dreams in grand, expansive strokes but rarely mention the practical steps to achieve them. At the time, I dismissed those details as quirks, thinking her ambitions simply needed time to catch up with reality. After all, wasn't it my role to support, to provide stability while she chased after the extraordinary? Another memory that stands out is when she came over to my apartment for the first time. She walked through each room, inspecting my neatly arranged bookshelves, my modest furniture, and the framed photographs of family vacations. "It's cozy," she said, though her tone carried an undertone I couldn't quite place. Within weeks, she was suggesting changes: brighter decor, new curtains, art pieces to replace what she called my sterile walls. I went along with it, eager to please, eager to create a space that felt more like ours. What I didn't realize was that this was the beginning of a pattern, her reshaping my world to fit her vision, while I quietly adjusted and told myself it was for the best. Our relationship accelerated quickly. Within 6 months, we were talking about moving in together, and although the decision was framed as practical, her lease ending, the convenience of sharing expenses, I knew it was about more than that. I felt proud that she wanted to share her life with me, that she saw me as a partner worth building with. My friends cautioned me not to rush, reminding me that love needed time to reveal itself fully, but I brushed off their concerns. To me, waiting felt unnecessary. I believed I had found someone special, and I wasn't about to let hesitation ruin what seemed destined to be. The early days of our cohabitation reinforced my conviction that I was doing the right thing. We laughed together while assembling furniture, shared late-night takeouts sprawled across the living room floor, and spent Sundays walking hand in hand through the park. In those moments, I felt a joy so palpable that it drowned out the doubts that occasionally flickered in the background. Yes, she spent money more freely than I was comfortable with, and yes, she sometimes dismissed my opinions too quickly. But wasn't that just part of adjusting to someone else's rhythm? I told myself love was about embracing differences, not tallying flaws. In hindsight, those beginnings tell a different story, one of subtle imbalances that set the tone for what was to come. I was giving more than I realized, bending more than I should, and ignoring the tiny alarms that went off in my mind. At the time, though, all I saw was a future filled with possibility. I believed that by holding steady, by being the reliable partner, I was laying the foundation for a love that could weather anything. What I didn't see was that I was also laying the groundwork for a pattern of one-sided sacrifice that would eventually lead to the very moment when she demanded I pay her credit card bill, and I chose a divorce lawyer instead. When I think about the period that I would describe as the best of our relationship, it was the stretch of time when everything seemed to align: her ambition, my stability, and the life we were constructing together under one roof. It wasn't perfect, but it was filled with enough warmth, laughter, and shared experiences to convince me that what we had was worth holding on to. Those were the moments that made me believe the sacrifices I was making were justified, and they painted such a vivid picture of hope, that I ignored the faint cracks forming beneath the surface. The first year we lived together was filled with what I now see as our honeymoon phase. Alyssa's energy was infectious, and she had a way of making even the most mundane activities feel like adventures. On Friday evenings, when I would normally be drained from long work hours, she would coax me into trying a new restaurant or attending an event downtown. We discovered a sushi spot tucked into a side street, where the chef greeted us by name after our third visit, and for weeks afterward we joked about becoming regulars there. Saturdays often began with coffee runs, her in oversized sunglasses and me carrying a stack of newspapers, followed by long walks where we fantasized about future vacations and dream houses. There was a tenderness in those days that felt genuine. She would leave little notes on the refrigerator before heading to work, playful reminders like, "Don't forget to eat lunch," or "Movie night tonight, your choice." Sometimes she would surprise me by cooking dinner, a rare but cherished occasion when the apartment filled with the smell of roasted vegetables and garlic bread. Those evenings, sitting across from each other at our small dining table, I felt a sense of partnership, of being cared for in a way that went beyond surface charm. Holidays became special milestones during that time. For Thanksgiving, we hosted a small dinner at our apartment, inviting a few friends and making our first attempt at roasting a turkey together. The bird came out dry and the stuffing slightly burnt, but we laughed through it, sipping wine and making do with what we had. That night, as the last of the dishes were drying and our guests had left, she leaned against me and said, "We're a team, Marcus. We've got this." Hearing those words, I felt an almost overwhelming pride, convinced that we were building something enduring. Travel also marked some of the highlights of our good times. We saved up, or at least I thought we saved up, for a week-long trip to San Diego. The sun-soaked beaches, the walks along the harbor, and the late-night conversations on the hotel balcony felt like snapshots of a future I desperately wanted to preserve. I remember watching her laugh as the ocean breeze whipped through her hair and thinking to myself that if happiness could be bottled, it would look exactly like that moment. Later, when she posted photos of us online with captions about being blessed and in love with life, I didn't mind. I believed those words. I believed she meant them. Even at home, in the quiet spaces, there was joy. We would binge-watch shows late into the night, her head resting on my shoulder as I absent-mindedly played with her hair. On rainy Sundays, we stayed in pajamas until noon, flipping through magazines and talking about hypothetical futures. What kind of house we'd want, how many kids we might have, what cities we'd love to live in someday. For someone like me, who had spent much of his adult life in routine, those shared imaginings felt intoxicating. They weren't just idle talk to me, they were promises I believed we were making to each other. Her charm extended to my family as well. When I introduced her to my parents, she impressed them with her warmth and her ability to hold conversations with both of them. My mother gushed afterward about how sweet and lively she was, and even my father, who tended to be reserved in his judgments, admitted she had a spark that brought me out of my shell. That validation cemented my belief that I had chosen wisely, that I had found someone who fit not only into my life but into my family's world as well. Financially, though there were hints of tension, there were also times when she contributed in ways that felt fair. She insisted on paying for groceries now and then, or surprising me with gifts that, while sometimes more extravagant than I would have chosen, carried sentimental weight. On my birthday, she bought me a leather briefcase, monogrammed with my initials, explaining that it was for the future executive version of me. That gesture touched me deeply, not just because of the gift itself, but because it showed she saw me not just as I was, but as I could be. Looking back, I see that the good times weren't just about shared happiness. They were about creating an emotional foundation strong enough to keep me invested even when the first cracks began to show. I was so enamored with the laughter, the travels, the intimacy, that I didn't question the moments that felt off. Like when she would tease me for being too serious about money, or when she brushed aside my concerns about her spending with a kiss and a quick distraction. I told myself those were minor issues, unworthy of overshadowing the joy we were experiencing. I think what made the good times so powerful was that they provided me with memories I could cling to whenever doubts arose. When I felt uneasy about her shopping habits, I would recall our San Diego trip and remind myself of the happiness I had seen in her eyes. When I worried about the imbalance of effort, I would think back to her surprising me with dinner and a note on the fridge. Those moments acted as anchors, keeping me tethered even as the waters around us began to grow turbulent. At the time, I believed love was about holding on to the best parts, about weathering the storms because the sun had once shone so brightly. And for a while, that belief was enough to keep me steady, to keep me giving more than I received, and to keep me blind to the subtle shifts that were already pulling us away from balance. The good times were real. They were full of laughter, intimacy, and hope. But they were also the camouflage that hid the early warning signs, making it far harder for me to see where the path we were on was truly leading. The shift didn't happen overnight, but rather crept in quietly, disguised at first as harmless quirks and minor disagreements, the sort of things most couples shrug off. I remember telling myself it was normal, that every relationship had rough edges, and that the good outweighed the bad. But looking back now, I see those first warning signs for what they were, the early tremors of something much larger that was waiting to crack the foundation we had built. They weren't obvious enough to scare me away, but they were sharp enough to leave small cuts that eventually bled into everything else. The first real sign came when our conversations about money, once lighthearted debates, began turning into pointed arguments. Alyssa had always enjoyed shopping and treating herself, but in the beginning she balanced it with enough small gestures of responsibility to keep me from worrying. That started to change gradually. I began noticing new packages arriving at our apartment almost every other day. Clothes, shoes, gadgets, home decor items that seemed more about impulse than necessity. When I raised an eyebrow, she laughed it off, saying, "Don't worry, Marcus, I got it on sale," as if the discount erased the cost. When I pressed further, she would pivot into charm, pulling me into an embrace or distracting me with a kiss, and for a while I let myself be soothed by it. But the frequency of those packages grew, and the credit card bills began climbing higher than I was comfortable with. One evening, after opening a statement that showed a charge for a designer handbag that cost nearly half of my monthly rent, I finally confronted her seriously. Instead of meeting me with understanding, she rolled her eyes and accused me of being controlling. "It's my money too, Marcus. Why do you always have to act like the fun police?" she snapped. That phrase stuck with me, the fun police, as though my effort to ensure we had stability was somehow robbing her of joy. It was the first time I realized we weren't aligned in how we valued things, and though I brushed it off, the sting lingered. Another warning sign was how she handled conflict in general. During our early months together, disagreements often ended in compromise or laughter. But slowly, her way of dealing with tension shifted toward avoidance or deflection. If I brought up something serious, like splitting bills more fairly or planning ahead for expenses, she would suddenly claim to be too tired to talk or would leave the room entirely. At first, I chalked it up to stress or timing, but the pattern hardened into something undeniable. She didn't want to engage with anything that threatened her comfort. Her tactic was to shut down the moment accountability entered the room. The cracks widened in smaller, subtler ways too. She began canceling plans with me more frequently, often at the last minute. Instead of our once regular Friday nights out or cozy movie nights in, she would tell me she was going out with friends, and when I asked if I could join, she would say it was just a girl's thing. I told myself she deserved her independence and that I shouldn't be clingy, but the exclusion felt deliberate, as if she was carving out a separate life that didn't include me. When I asked about it, she brushed me off with phrases like, "You wouldn't enjoy it anyway," or "Don't be so dramatic, Marcus." Those dismissals chipped away at me more than I wanted to admit. Another moment that raised a quiet alarm came when she began comparing our relationship to others. She would casually mention what her friends' boyfriends were doing: lavish vacations, expensive gifts, spontaneous getaways, and then sigh dramatically, leaving the implication hanging in the air that I wasn't measuring up. Once, while scrolling through her phone beside me, she showed me a photo of her friend's engagement ring and said, "Now that's how you show someone you're serious." The comment was delivered with a laugh, but the underlying message wasn't lost on me. I started to feel like I was competing against invisible benchmarks set by people who had nothing to do with us. Social media became another battlefield. At first, I enjoyed seeing her post pictures of us, documenting our trips and outings. But her online persona began to morph into something less about us and more about appearances. She curated our life to look glamorous, sometimes even embellishing details to make things appear grander than they were. When I voiced discomfort about how fake it sometimes felt, she dismissed me again, saying, It's just for fun. Why are you taking everything so seriously?" That refrain, me being too serious, started to echo through our relationship, making me feel like my desire for authenticity was somehow a flaw. Even intimacy, once easy and affectionate, began showing signs of strain. There were nights when she turned away from me, citing exhaustion, stress, or simply not being in the mood. I respected her boundaries, of course, but the rejection carried a quiet heaviness that accumulated over time. It wasn't just about physical closeness. It was about the growing emotional distance that came with it. She seemed less interested in the simple acts of connection, like holding hands on the couch or lingering in conversation before bed. The warmth that had once flowed so naturally began to feel rationed. What hurt the most, though, was the erosion of respect and subtle jabs she began throwing my way. They weren't outright cruel, but they were barbed enough to leave marks. If I forgot something minor, she'd quip, "You're so hopeless sometimes." If I dressed more casually, she'd smirk and say, "You really don't care how you look, do you?" Delivered with a laugh. These comments were easy to brush off in the moment, but their accumulation weighed on me. I started questioning myself, wondering if I really was falling short in ways I hadn't noticed. Still, despite these warning signs, I clung to the good memories and convinced myself these issues were temporary. I told myself she was under stress, that she would grow out of these habits, and that every couple hit rough patches. I rationalized her dismissals as quirks, her spending as indulgence, her distance as independence. I buried the discomfort because I wanted so badly to preserve the image of us that I had fallen in love with. But the truth is, those first warning signs weren't just minor flaws in an otherwise solid relationship. They were the beginning of a pattern that would deepen, intensify, and eventually overwhelm everything else. And by ignoring them, I was unknowingly laying the groundwork for the storm that was waiting just over the horizon. The moment things shifted from discomfort to undeniable fracture wasn't a single explosion, but rather a slow build that culminated in one evening I can never forget. It was the night I realized that the balance I had been struggling to maintain had collapsed completely, that the relationship I had convinced myself was salvageable had veered into a territory where love alone could not carry it. If the early warning signs had been whispers, this was the thunderclap that shook me awake. It started with something deceptively small, a missed dinner. We had planned to meet at a restaurant she had been raving about for weeks, a place that required reservations weeks in advance. I left work early, eager to surprise her by being on time, only to sit at the table alone for nearly an hour. When she finally arrived, she didn't come alone. She walked in with two of her friends, laughing, holding shopping bags, and treating me like an afterthought. "I hope you don't mind," she said, kissing my cheek quickly before sliding into the booth. We made it a group thing. I forced a smile, but inside I felt something collapse. It wasn't the dinner or even the friends. It was the message behind it, that my presence was optional, that my effort was disposable. That dinner turned into a performance for her friends, where she made jokes at my expense, exaggerating my seriousness and calling me Old Man Marcus for preferring to budget rather than splurge. Her friends laughed, not realizing how much it stung, and I sat there swallowing my pride, pushing food around my plate while she basked in their attention. When I tried to address it afterward, she dismissed me with her usual line, "You're too sensitive. They were just jokes." But something inside me hardened. It wasn't just about sensitivity. It was about respect, and I felt it slipping through my fingers. Not long after, the financial tension escalated into something that couldn't be brushed aside. I discovered she had opened a credit card in her name and maxed it out within months. The purchases weren't for necessities but for luxury items, designer clothes, high-end makeup, spa packages. When I confronted her, her response floored me. "Why are you acting like it's your problem?" she shot back. "It's my card, my debt. You don't get to control me." I wasn't asking to control her. I was pleading for partnership, for responsibility. But she twisted it into a battle for independence, leaving me with the bitter realization that we weren't even playing on the same team. The real turning point, though, came one night during an argument that started over something trivial: dirty dishes left in the sink. What began as a small complaint from me spiraled into a torrent from her. She accused me of being boring, of holding her back, of suffocating her freedom. "I need space from this marriage," she finally said, her voice sharp as a blade. The words cut through me in a way I can't fully describe. For years, I had poured myself into building something with her, and now she was telling me she saw it as a cage. I remember standing there in stunned silence, my hands trembling, my chest hollow. The next morning I found my belongings packed into boxes by the door. My shirts folded carelessly, my books thrown into bags, my toothbrush sticking out of a grocery sack. She didn't even look guilty. Instead, she sipped coffee at the counter, scrolling on her phone, and said, "I thought you'd appreciate the head start." When I asked her if this was really what she wanted, she didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "I just need space. If you love me, you'll give me that." It was then that I realized her version of space wasn't about breathing room. It was about removing me from the picture altogether. What made it all the more devastating was how quickly she seemed to move on emotionally. Within days, her social media was filled with photos of her out with friends, smiling wide, captions about new beginnings and living life to the fullest. Meanwhile, I was in the apartment I had scrambled to find on short notice, staring at the bare walls and wondering how the woman I loved could discard me so easily. That was the true turning point. Not just the fight, not just the packed bags, but the realization that I had been loving someone who never intended to love me back in the same way. All the excuses I had made for her, all the rationalizations, evaporated in that single stretch of days. I could no longer pretend we were just going through a rough patch. This wasn't a storm we could wait out. It was the dismantling of everything we had built, and I was being forced to watch it crumble while she walked away unscathed. Looking back, that moment was painful, but it was also clarifying. The veil had been lifted. The laughter, the trips, the whispered promises. They had all been real, but they weren't enough to outweigh the truth that was now staring me in the face. She wanted freedom, not partnership. And no matter how much love I still carried for her, I couldn't keep us together alone. If the turning point had cracked the walls of the life I thought we were building, the breaking point was when they finally collapsed, leaving nothing but dust and the raw truth I could no longer ignore. I had already been displaced from the home that had once felt like ours, left to piece myself together in a small one-bedroom apartment that smelled of new paint and emptiness. I spent those first few weeks in a daze, clinging to the hope that maybe she'd come around, that her demand for space was temporary, that we could still find our way back to each other. But the universe has a way of peeling off illusions when you refuse to do it yourself, and soon enough, I found the validation I hadn't wanted but desperately needed. It started when my sister Rachel came over one evening. She brought food because she knew I hadn't been eating much, and after pushing me to open up, she asked a question that lodged in my chest. "Marcus, do you even realize how badly she treated you?" I tried to protest, to defend Alyssa, but Rachel cut me off gently, but firmly. "I saw how she spoke to you. The little digs. The way she acted like you were always in the wrong. We all saw it, Marcus. We just didn't know how to tell you without pushing you away." Her words stung because I knew they were true. I had been so wrapped up in protecting the image of our relationship that I had blinded myself to the reality others could see clearly. The validation didn't stop there. A few days later, my friend Daniel invited me out for coffee. He hesitated at first, as though unsure if he should say what was on his mind, but eventually he laid it out. "I don't know how else to put this, man," he said, stirring his drink. "But Alyssa didn't treat you like a partner. She treated you like a safety net. And when she didn't need the net anymore, she cut it loose." I sat there stunned, trying to process the harsh truth wrapped in his kindness. He leaned forward and added, "You deserve someone who doesn't make you feel like a burden just for wanting respect." It was the first time I heard someone say out loud what I had been too afraid to admit. That love, at least the kind she had given me, wasn't enough. It wasn't about needing space or needing freedom. It was about her valuing things: attention, luxury, validation from others, more than she valued the bond we were supposed to share. And as much as it hurt, hearing Daniel and Rachel confirm what my gut had been whispering for months finally gave me the clarity I needed. The final confirmation came in a cruel twist of timing. One night, scrolling aimlessly through social media, I stumbled upon photos Alyssa had posted. She wasn't just out with friends anymore. She was with someone new. A man I didn't recognize, his arm around her waist, her face lit up with the kind of smile she hadn't given me in months. The caption read, "New chapter, new adventures." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening, my stomach twisting. It wasn't just the betrayal of her moving on so quickly, it was the realization that she had already replaced me in her narrative, rewriting herself as the hero of a story where I had been nothing but a supporting character. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the silence of my apartment, replaying every moment, every choice, every warning sign I had ignored. I thought about the packages, the dismissive jokes, the way she had packed my things without a shred of hesitation. It all came together like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to assemble. The picture was clear now. She had been walking away from me long before she ever said the words. I was just the last one to notice. But what could have broken me completely instead lit a fire inside me. Because in that moment of utter devastation, I realized I had reached the bottom. And once you're at the bottom, there's only one direction left to go. I couldn't change Alyssa. I couldn't make her see value in me or in what we had built. But I could reclaim myself. For months, maybe even years, I had been giving and giving until there was nothing left, convincing myself that love meant sacrifice. Now I understood that real love doesn't require you to erase yourself to keep someone else comfortable. I remember picking up the phone and calling Rachel the next morning. When she answered, I told her everything I had seen, everything I now understood. She didn't say "I told you so." She just said, "Good. Now you can finally start living for you." Those words became a lifeline, because for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. Not the desperate hope that she might return, but the steady resolve that I no longer wanted her to. The breaking point wasn't just about Alyssa's betrayal or the validation from others. It was about finally accepting the truth I had fought so hard to deny, that the person I had loved was not the person I thought she was, and that holding on to her meant losing myself entirely. And that was a price I was no longer willing to pay. Clarity has a strange way of arriving. For months, I had been wandering through fog, second-guessing myself, replaying arguments, and clinging to scraps of hope that maybe, somehow, things would return to the way they once were. But once I reached the breaking point, once I saw Alyssa smiling in another man's arms and realized everyone around me had been quietly waiting for me to see what they already knew, the fog lifted. It wasn't a dramatic lightning bolt or a cinematic epiphany. It was more like a steady, calm certainty settling over me. For the first time in a long while, I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to stop being a spectator in my own life and start making choices that honored my dignity, my peace, and my future. The first step was deciding that I no longer wanted to patch up what had been broken. There was no salvaging a relationship built on dismissals, disrespect, and betrayal. I sat in my apartment late into the night, staring at a blank sheet of paper, writing down what I wanted my life to look like a year from now. The words that came out weren't elaborate. They were simple. Peace, stability, respect, freedom. None of those things were possible as long as I stayed tethered to her. Divorce wasn't just an option anymore, it was a necessity. That realization gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. For so long, Alyssa had been dictating the terms of our relationship. When we talked, when we fought, when we reconciled, when we drifted apart. Now for the first time I was taking the wheel. The very next morning I scheduled a consultation with a divorce lawyer. Walking into that office was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant acknowledging the finality of it all. Liberating because it meant I was no longer waiting for her to decide my fate. The lawyer, a calm and pragmatic woman named Evelyn, listened carefully as I explained my situation. She didn't flinch when I recounted Alyssa's spending habits, her emotional withdrawal, or her abrupt demand for space. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "Marcus, you've already done the hardest part. You've accepted the truth. Now it's about protecting yourself and moving forward." Her words felt like a lifeline. She laid out the steps in clear terms, what papers needed to be filed, what assets needed to be divided, what my rights were. For the first time, the path forward didn't feel abstract. It was practical, tangible, achievable. The irony wasn't lost on me that Alyssa had once told me, "Pay my credit card," as if my role in her life was to shoulder her financial recklessness without complaint. And here I was, instead, paying a divorce lawyer to secure my freedom. That poetic justice gave me a quiet strength. Every signature I placed on the paperwork, every document I gathered, felt like reclaiming pieces of myself she had chipped away. Of course, making the decision didn't erase the emotional weight overnight. There were still moments when I doubted myself, when guilt tried to creep in, whispering that maybe I was overreacting, maybe I should have tried harder, maybe love was supposed to be messy and painful. But every time those doubts surfaced, I remembered the photo of her with another man, the nights I spent alone waiting for her to come home, the way she had laughed at my expense in front of her friends. Love might be messy, but it should never be humiliating, degrading, or one-sided. That clarity anchored me when the guilt threatened to drag me back. One of the hardest steps was telling her. I didn't do it in anger, though part of me wanted to. I didn't throw accusations or rehash old arguments. Instead, I met her in a neutral place, a quiet cafe where the hum of conversations created a buffer. When she walked in, dressed impeccably as always, she gave me that same careless smile she used whenever she thought she still held the upper hand. I didn't waste time. I filed for divorce, I told her plainly. For a moment, she looked stunned, as if the possibility had never crossed her mind. Then her expression shifted into disbelief, even mockery. "You can't be serious," she said, laughing under her breath. "You're not built for that, Marcus. You don't have the spine." Her words could have gutted me once, but not anymore. This time, I met her gaze steadily and replied, "I found it." She scoffed, tried to turn it into another performance about how impulsive I was being, how I would regret it. But her words no longer had power over me. I had made my decision, and her opinion about it was irrelevant. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to her. I was acting for myself. Walking out of that cafe, I felt lighter than I had in years. The world didn't magically change. The streets were still crowded, the air still thick with city noise. But inside, something had shifted. I was no longer the man begging for scraps of affection, no longer the one trying to rationalize away disrespect. I was the man who had chosen himself. In the days that followed, I threw myself into the process. I reorganized my finances, set boundaries with communication, and leaned heavily on the support of my family and friends. Rachel checked in often, reminding me that healing wasn't linear, that there would be bad days and good days, but that I was moving in the right direction. Daniel dragged me to the gym, insisting that channeling my frustration into something physical would help. And slowly, piece by piece, I felt my strength returning, not just physical strength, but the emotional resilience I thought I had lost. Taking action didn't mean the pain disappeared, but it transformed it. Instead of pain that paralyzed me, it became fuel. Fuel for building a life where I no longer had to compromise my self-worth. Fuel for proving to myself that I was more than the man she had belittled and dismissed. Filing for divorce was more than a legal step. It was a declaration to myself that I was done being defined by her neglect. The decision was hard, the action even harder, but as I moved forward, I knew with absolute certainty that it was the only choice that honored who I was and who I wanted to become. And though I didn't yet know what the future held, for the first time I wasn't afraid of it. The day the divorce papers were finalized felt almost surreal. After months of build-up lawyer meetings, signatures, tense exchanges with Alyssa, and long nights questioning myself, it all came down to a plain envelope slid across a polished wooden desk. The official seal confirmed it. The chapter of my life that had once felt like it would last forever was now closed. I stared at the document for a long while, tracing the letters of my name with my eyes, almost as if to remind myself that I was free. Free from the suffocating cycle of dismissal and disrespect, free from carrying someone else's debts and whims, free from the hollow echo of promises never kept. And in that freedom, I didn't feel the crushing grief I had braced myself for. Instead, I felt an unexpected calm, as though my spirit had been carrying a heavy weight I hadn't even realized until it was finally set down. Executing the decision had been far from easy. The practical side of divorce meant dividing assets, negotiating terms, and confronting Alyssa in settings that stripped away any illusion of intimacy. She didn't make it easy. At times, she acted outraged, as if I were the one betraying her, and at other times, she tried to play sweet, dangling the possibility of reconciliation like a carrot. But I had already steeled myself against her tactics. Evelyn, my lawyer, had warned me that she might try to sway me emotionally, but I surprised even myself with how resolute I remained. Each time Alyssa tried to reopen old wounds with her words, I reminded myself of the countless times I had gone to bed, feeling small, unheard, and unloved. That memory was stronger than any fleeting temptation to give in. Outside of the legal battles, I worked diligently to rebuild my life piece by piece. I decluttered my apartment, throwing out items that carried her scent, her style, her ghost. The empty shelves slowly filled with things that reflected me. Books I had put off reading, framed photographs of my family, small plants that added life to the corners. I cooked for myself, often poorly at first, but the act of nourishing my body felt symbolic. For years, I had poured into someone else and neglected myself. Now, every meal I cooked, every decision I made about my space was an affirmation that I deserved care too. I also rediscovered passions I had long shelved. Music had always been a quiet refuge for me, but during my marriage I had stopped playing guitar because Alyssa called it a waste of time. Picking it back up felt like reclaiming an old friend. My fingers stumbled across the strings at first, clumsy and unsure, but soon enough, the muscle memory returned. Playing late into the night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just about the music. It was about remembering that I had parts of myself that no one could take away, no matter how much they tried to diminish me. The support of those around me became the scaffolding I leaned on as I rebuilt. Rachel was there through it all, steady and unflinching, reminding me that my worth had never been tied to Alyssa's approval. Daniel and other friends pulled me back into the world, encouraging me to laugh again, to trust again, to believe that my story didn't end with heartbreak. It wasn't easy. I had nights where the silence felt oppressive, where memories crept in uninvited, where I questioned if I had somehow failed. But each time I stumbled, the people who truly cared for me reminded me that healing isn't linear, that it's okay to feel the ache, as long as I didn't let it define me. The new beginning wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was in the quiet moments, waking up in my own bed without dread, walking into my apartment and feeling peace instead of tension, looking at my bank account and knowing I wasn't funding someone else's indulgence. It was in the small victories, like laughing without the undertone of guilt, or standing tall when I ran into mutual acquaintances who once only knew me as Alyssa's husband. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like someone's shadow. I felt like myself. Reflecting on it now, I realized that the greatest gift of that painful chapter wasn't in what I lost, but in what I gained. I gained clarity about the kind of love I deserve, the kind that doesn't belittle, dismiss, or manipulate. I gained resilience, discovering strength I didn't know I had until I was forced to face it. Most importantly, I gained myself back. I had been so focused on saving a marriage that I had nearly sacrificed the very essence of who I was. Walking away didn't mean I failed. It meant I finally succeeded in choosing me. When I look at the story in its entirety, the lesson is painfully simple, yet profoundly true. Love without respect is a cage, not a sanctuary. Partnership without accountability is a burden, not a blessing. And no amount of history or hope can justify staying in a place where you are not valued. I once thought loyalty meant holding on no matter what. Now I know that real loyalty begins with yourself, loyalty to your peace, your dignity, your future. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd find freedom through divorce, I wouldn't have believed them. I would have clung to the fairy tale of enduring love, convinced that walking away was the ultimate failure. But today, standing on the other side, I see it differently. Walking away was not giving up. It was growing up. It was recognizing that some endings are not tragedies, but transformations. And while the scars remain, they are reminders of what I endured and overcame, not symbols of defeat. So if there's a universal truth in my story, it's this. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is the one you extend to yourself. Sometimes the most courageous step isn't holding on, but letting go. And when you do, you don't just close a door. You open an entirely new chapter filled with the possibility of a life you once thought was out of reach. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.